We're looking at the workbook called Useful Macros. In the previous movie, we created the Personal Macro Workbook. When you create a Personal Macro Workbook, it means that from there on, it's always going to be available as you open and close Excel. But you've got to be sensitive as to its contents and what happens if you're editing and what would happen if there were a power failure or a system crash. Let's remind ourselves as we press Alt F11, and you can do this at any time when you're working with Excel. If there is a Personal Macro Workbook, you will see it in the project window when you come into the VBA environment here. Remember, if you're not seeing the VBA project window, choose View, and then you'll see Project Explorer right here. That's the window we're talking about. If the Personal Macro Workbook exists, you see it over here. It might have many modules in it. In the previous movie, we created a Personal Macro Workbook. We changed the name of its module to Utility Macros, and there they are. And again, potentially these are available indefinitely. The current workbook might also have modules in it, and it does, and there's some macros there as well too. If we double-click Module 1, we'll see those. So what happens here as we work with Excel and we open and close different files? I'm going to jump back into Excel with Alt F11. If I close this file right now, I'm going to press Control W. I've got no open file. What happens when I press Alt F11? We're back here. We only see Personal over here. It's open, but we don't see it. Let's jump back into Excel. Now I might want to open that file again. I'll simply press Control O. I'll see it out here as a recently opened file. So we're opening the same file over again. And sometimes you'll see a notice like this. This is explained in a prior movie. Enable macros. We want to see them and potentially use them. So we've got this workbook open here. Now, what would happen if we create some new macros and store them here? We jump back and forth into Excel. We might close that other file, but what if somewhere along the line there's a system crash after we've added some additional macros, or there's a power failure? It doesn't happen too often for most people these days, but occasionally it does. You're going to lose any changes you've made here. Keep in mind that the Personal Macro Workbook actually is a file. And so as we work with it, we want to be thinking along the same lines as what we think about when we work with other files. Let's save them from time to time. So in this VBA environment, from time to time, we want to go to the File menu and choose Save, not necessarily the current file, but click Personal first, then go to File, Save, Personal. Remember, the file name is personal.xlsb. You're simply updating it in the same way that you do this with other files that you work with. In the previous movie, I talked about the idea that the Personal Macro Workbook is hidden, and this throws people a little bit. Let me remind you what happens here. If you happen to go to the Developer tab, and maybe you're considering looking at some of the macro code, this is certainly one approach, although not nearly as efficient as pressing Alt F11. However, when you press the Developer tab and go to the second button from the left, Macros, this will show you macros either in all open workbooks or maybe just Personal. Let's say we want to look at just the ones in Personal. Do not use these as a vehicle for trying to see the code. If you click one of these and then click Edit, we get this message about you cannot edit a macro in a hidden workbook. So what's this idea behind a hidden workbook? When you open Excel, Excel automatically opens the Personal Macro Workbook once it's been created, of course. Now, we could, if we wanted to, go to the View tab, but there's no real reason to do what I'm about to do. Now, some people say, well, why is Unhide available here? What does that mean? Do we have a hidden file? Unhide, and there it is, Personal Macro Workbook. Remember, this opens with Excel, but it opens as a hidden workbook. Now, I can unhide this. I'll click OK, but why am I doing this? There's no good reason to do this. What is this? It's an empty workbook that holds a lot of macros. So there's no real reason to unhide Personal Macro Workbook. I'm going to essentially undo this, not by way of the undo feature, but View. I'm going to go back here and hide this workbook. So that two-step process that I just went through of unhiding and then hiding the Personal Macro Workbook, don't even bother doing it. It's not necessary. It is an oddity, and sometimes people get confused by this idea that on the Developer tab, when they're trying to look at code, if the code happens to be in Personal Macro Workbook, you can't get into the VBA environment by way of edit here. Remember, Alt F11 is going to be the fastest entry into Visual Basic and away from it. Now, let's suppose I've finished working with this file. I'm going to close it. I'll press Control W. Fast way to do it. I don't want to save the changes I've made here. And now I want to exit from Excel. Upper right-hand corner, I click the X. I've made changes to the Personal Macro Workbook. Nearly every time you see this, you will want to click Save. Now, I might have added new macros here. I might have taken out macros. I've made changes. Did I save that file along the way? Well, you saw that I did it once, but maybe I forgot to do it. And maybe I've made some changes since. And so, if we're doing a normal exit from Excel, be sure when you see this prompt, click Save.